We started P22 further down than we wanted to. We thought we had the pace to be much higher up the field than that, but you will generally find that all the very quick drivers go in for qualifying. You only ever really know where you stand in a 24-hour race after the first 12 hours, after everyone's had a chance to get in the car, which is usually around about the halfway mark. So Benjamin, who qualified for us, he wasn't particularly happy with qualifying P22. Personally, I wasn't worried. You never finish where you start in a 24-hour race. There's so much that can happen. So I certainly wasn't concerned about our starting position. It just, if anything, kind of meant that we could hang back a little bit in the first, the first half hour, first stint or so, and just kind of really observe and see what happened, and just kind of ease into the race gradually. First stint, there wasn't kind of much particularly, to be honest. I mean, there was definitely a couple of fairly aggressive moves by drivers of every class, which you would expect. So getting through the first stint, the only thing that you really need to do is just try and survive. So we managed to do that without any issues whatsoever. So Benjamin finished his stints absolutely fine, no problems whatsoever. I think we were up to about P10, P11 by that point, which again, we qualified P22. We'd already made up 10 plus spaces even in the first 2 hours. So we were still very much in touch with the leading cars, 20, 30 seconds back, I think it was at that point. But again, in a 24-hour race, 30 seconds is nothing. And especially given most drivers that started were still in the car, who we knew had qualified faster than us. There was no cause for concern. So once Benjamin had done his first double stint, Eric then went and got in the car. Again, started off pretty well. We just kind of needed to really kind of tick the laps off and not really kind of think too much about what was happening. Unfortunately, we ran into our first incident not long after Eric got in the car. This was about 2.25 hours and something along those lines. We were coming out of the Turn 3 Hairpin International Horseshoe. There were two GTPs. One of them tagged right front to rear left as they were coming alongside us, which put one of the GTPs into our side and put us into the wall. We were completely blameless, exactly the wrong place, exactly the wrong time. If it had happened a second later, it would have missed us. If it happened a second earlier, they would have missed us. So it was incredibly unfortunate. Nothing that Eric could have done. Not his fault in any way, shape or form. So we had to limp back to the pits. It was about a 3-minute repair job. Again, in a 24-hour race, 3 minutes, that's going to lose you, 2 laps? There's plenty of time to make that back. So it was annoying. It wasn't the best start we could have hoped for. Especially after 2 hours, but there was still loads else that could happen. We knew there was rain coming by this point. There was definitely some rain on the radar. We could see it in the weather tab on the user interface, so we knew it was coming. It really was just a case of when rather than if it was coming. And towards the end of my second stint, we could see the rain on the radar just getting closer and closer, and Benjamin and Eric were both calling that out for me, trying to explain to me when the rain was going to hit. So got something that gives me the track wetness. Oh yeah, I'm getting some spots on the windshield now. So the rain hit the track. It was fairly light, so you could stay on the dry tyres for a few laps at least, so there wasn't any kind of massive need to rush into the pits straight away. The track was only kind of wetting up and getting damp rather than properly wet, so we didn't need to take any kind of huge, kind of sudden risks coming in for wets early. But the only issue that there was that there was going to be one quite light patch of rain, which was then going to dissipate, and then we were going to get another patch coming in about 15-20 minutes later. So I put a wheel on a white line coming onto the banking, just did a half spin of the car, certainly nothing to be worried about, no damage, only lost us about 3 or 4 seconds. But by that point we were starting to slide around a bit. The balance was definitely gone. And the Mustang, I think, is not the best car in the wet either. I'm changing the tyres to wet. So we decided that we were going to box just a couple of laps before the end of my stint, switched over to wets. Benjamin got back in the car. A couple of other cars decided to stay out on dries. A couple of the cars decided to stay out on wet. So there was a little bit of a split in the strategy at this point as to who wanted to do what. We were a little bit quicker initially on the wet tyres as the track cooled, as the moisture on the track increased. But when that first lot of rain dissipated, the track started to dry up, the wet started to overheat, and we started to lose time again. But we had committed. That was a thing. We were kind of saying as we switched to wets, we have to go with this now. If we come back in and switch back to dries, we're going to have to switch back to wets again, and we're going to lose even more time. So just got to make a decision, just got to stick to it, basically. And we were going to be better off just kind of grinning and bearing that drying track period on the wets before the rain really hit. So there was, kind of 10, 15 minutes where the wets were getting pretty warm and where we were struggling for grip, but it was going to lose us less time to stay out and then come back in for dries. And the chaos ensued. Basically, for about 16 hours, the chaos ensued. This was the hardest endurance race I have ever done. It was just a combination of everything that happened, the conditions that happened, the fatigue, the standard of the split that we were in, the changeable conditions. There was just so much happening and so much going on and so much to think about that it's easy to look back on the race overall and think that where we finished was a failure. So I get back in the car with about 14 hours to go at this point. We're back on dries by this point, actually. We were really trying to see who was going onto dries, and we knew the crossover was going to be at about 1 minute 51, 1 minute 52 to be really safe. The dry line was probably about 2 car widths wide by this point around the entire track, so it was definitely possible to stay online. But if you're a prototype trying to go offline and pass other cars, it was pretty deadly. And I saw more than once prototypes going offline, maybe coming out of bus stop on dries and just smacking the wall because they suddenly go onto the wet stuff and there's absolutely no grip. So although the track was dry and drying, the conditions were still very treacherous offline. So as a GT3, we were probably kind of okay here at this point. We just needed to be very conscious of of prototypes, the GTPs and the LMP2s potentially being offline and maybe getting into issues of their own. But we were generally okay here. Coming into the pits, you've still got this band of water across the pit entry. So if you're on dries and you're coming in, you need to tiptoe into the pits because it's wet. Even if there's not these pools of water, it's still really damp because you're not coming into the pits as often as you're going over other bits of the track. So we're talking about 11 and a half hours in at this point. We're almost halfway. Benjamin's coming in to finish, I believe it was the second of his 3 stints. I can't quite recall at this point, if I'm honest. Benjamin was coming in to finish the second of his 3 stints. He's coming out of the bus stop, so you're about 20 seconds away from pit entry by this point, and he says, I need to be careful on the pit entry because I know it's damp. He comes off the racing line on dry tyres onto a very damp pit lane with some standing water. Comes very far over to the left-hand side, which was completely the right thing to do to try and avoid the water. Gets half a tyre on one of the puddles. Spins the car, and yet it was a huge hit. It was an absolutely enormous hit, and it was about 20 minutes of repairs because the front of the car was gone. So by this point, the track has been at some of the toughest conditions I've ever seen on iRacing for close to 10 hours by this point. It started to rain just before 6 hours in, so 18 hours to go. We're now just about 8 hours to go. We've had a drying track for several hours, but it's just been carnage. The attrition rate has been enormous, and it's now started to rain again. Now, we talked in the build-up about how I didn't feel like it had been the best build-up for me, how I didn't feel like I was driving particularly well, how I wasn't particularly confident. That triple stint in the rain was the best driving I've ever done in iRacing. Alright, that was a really, really good triple stint. And I don't really know how to explain it, because there was nothing about my build-up for me that said you should have been able to do that. I should have put that car on the wall about 6 times. There were several points where I was driving purely on muscle memory because I couldn't see the side of the track. There was so much spray from cars in front of me. And I said on stream, I can't see anything.
Let this go through.
Can't see anything. Or worse to that effect, it was 4 a.m. at this point for me. But for 3 hours, I did some of the best driving I've ever done. It wasn't the quickest, I'm not going to lie. I wasn't the quickest car on track, although I don't actually think I was that far off on reflection. But I think I got 2 incident points in 3 hours, which is insane. And I finished that triple stint and I said, I'm really happy with how that went. And by this point, we had about 4 or 5 hours to go, I think. I'm just having a quick look now to kind of... So 5 hours to go. We had 5 hours to go when I entered the pits. And we knew at this point we were going to make it. We were still in a fairly big fight for 10th place by this point as well. You know, I think we were only about a lap behind P10. And given the way this race has gone, we could have finished in the top 5 still. So anything could have happened in this race still. But we knew we were going to finish, which was such a big thing. So I finished my triple at this point. Benjamin got back in the car for a couple of hours, and it's light by this point, which does always help. You know, driving in the wet is one thing. Driving in the wet when it's dark, even at Daytona when you do have the floodlights, is very, very tricky. And with about 4 hours to go, the rain finished, thank God. So we can actually start to look forward to a dry finish to this race. With about 3 hours to go, the track was pretty dry, so only about an hour after the rain had stopped. And we had multiple cars in GT3 switching to dry tyres. I, at this point, was keeping an eye on everybody else that was pitting to see what tyres that they were going on to. And there had been some cars about 20 minutes before that had tried dries and they just slipped and slid and spun everywhere. So we knew at that point it wasn't ready for dries. But when the leaders put on dry tyres and suddenly were dropping 5 seconds a lap quicker than us in terms of lap times, we knew it was time. So just to play it a little bit cautiously, we left it another lap or two just to kind of make absolutely sure that this wasn't just, you know, very, very lucky driving on a very narrow drying line. But it was fine. I then got in for the last stint, the last kind of 40 minutes or so, 5 laps behind P10, 5 laps ahead of P12. So we weren't going to gain any positions by our own luck. We were only going to gain positions by the misfortune of others, which is not something I don't like to gain positions by misfortune, but you've got to take positions when you can. We didn't need to push at all, and that's kind of what we did kind of for the last 40 minutes or so. So coming across the line, suddenly we go from P11 to P10. P10. It actually had transpired, and we'd known this for about an hour or so, that the car in P10 was going to get disqualified because one of their drivers hadn't shown up. They weren't, even if they'd shown up for the last hour, they weren't going to get enough laps in to get their fair share. So we knew we were basically in P10 by default, effectively, due to a pending disqualification. So we come across the line in P10 and managed to finish the Daytona 24 in 10th place, having started in 22nd. As I said, the toughest endurance race that I've ever done by a long, long way. And it's going to take something very brutal to beat that. And I don't even want to know how brutal it would need to be ahead of that, because there was just so much that happened. The conditions were so variable. There were so many drivers kind of coming and going throughout the race that you didn't know where to look. at various points in this race. Fatigue set in. I think maybe some drivers didn't necessarily understand what the conditions were or what the conditions were going to do. And I'm not saying that in a holier than thou sense in the fact that we knew what the conditions were like. I just think there was overall an underestimation of what the conditions were like in the race. We went into this with very high expectations. I remember posting in our Discord server when we put the teams together that we can win this, the three of us, and obviously that didn't happen. There's always next year. I think it's quite funny that I've now done 3 Daytona 24s, and my best result was my first one when I finished second. Finished 11th in 2024, finished 10th this year. So if we keep going, first is going to happen eventually, right? But it just goes to show that there are so many factors involved in this sort of event that finishing is a massive achievement. And I think it's very easy to forget that. I look back on the Daytona 24 and I'm very proud of what we achieved. I am very proud of how we kept going, of how we overcame adversity. So no, things didn't go particularly well. We crashed 4 times. We spent probably 40 minutes in the pits with repairs. But we learn a lot from it. And when the going gets tough in the future, all I need to say is let's remember Daytona.